Welcome to the third episode of the three-part series on Sewing A to Z. Learning the ABCs of sewing will boost your sewing and quilting skills if you're a newbie to this creative art, or perhaps refresh your knowledge if you've been sewing and quilting for years. So far, we've gotten about 2/3 of the way through the alphabet, featuring one technique from each letter. Please join me as we continue this sewing journey, Sewing A to Z. That's what's coming up next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest-airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, is made possible by Baby Lock, a complete line of sewing, quilting, and embroidery machines and sergers. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Madeira, specializing in embroidery, quilting, and special effect threads, because creativity is never black and white. Koala Studios, fine sewing furniture custom built in America. Clover, makers of sewing, knitting, quilting, and embroidery products for over 25 years. Experience the Clover difference. Amazing Designs and Class A Needles.
S is for snaps, snaps that swing. It's an ideal technique to effortlessly prevent gaping of two edges that must meet. In Sewing A to Z, we're sewing with some very basic techniques, but important techniques. I've used some supersized snaps so that you could see more clearly, but the snap that swings is sewn to one side of the edges that must meet, just sewing 1/4 of the opening to the fabric. Then to find out where its mate should land on the other side of the fabric, use chalk, darken the ball of the snap, fold it over, make sure the edges are aligned, and depress. And after you do this, you should have a mark right where the snap should be placed, where to center it. Now when you're working with smaller snaps, this is even more important because sometimes it's difficult to see. Then this time you can hand stitch all 4 areas of the snap, of course, to the fabric. Now sometimes when you're sewing on buttons or snaps or using any hand sewing like hemming, your thread may tangle, so a consideration is to use beeswax or a thread conditioner. Thread your needle. I'm going to use a double thread right now, and then over this thread conditioner, I'll just move my chalk, then you simply just guide the thread over this conditioner and you'll not have tangling. It really will work easily. And then you can just simply hand sew all sections down. Simple sewing. Now for snaps, there's another type of snap where it overlaps. You do the same thing. Put on the ball end of the snap first of all, wherever you may like it, and then darken it. Darken the ball portion, and then overlap, making certain that it's lining up just the way you'd like it. Depress, and again you'll have a marking, and you can place the opposite side of the snap over the opening. And hand stitch in place using the same techniques. So when you're doing some hand sewing and you need snaps, whether they're plastic snaps, metal snaps as I have here, this is a technique, one of these 2 techniques that certainly help you make the snaps align and your edges meet perfectly. T is for top stitching. Add a custom accent with double threads and a top stitching needle. Often when you're top stitching, you'll need it as an accent, and you would like it to show more than not show. So one of the ways to do this is to work with double threads, and I have 2 threads on the spool, the horizontal spool, and I have them unwinding in opposite directions so that they will not tangle. One comes from the top and the other one from the bottom, and then you just thread them through the machine as if they were one. Because you're using 2 threads, make certain that you use a needle that can accommodate 2 threads, and a top stitching needle has a larger eye, and you can simply, as I have done, put one of these right into my machine, and I'm just about ready to sew. But I also like to use a foot that allows me to guide the fabric right next to the edge. The edge joining foot, edge stitching foot looks different on every machine. This one has a little lip. The one I'm working on, my machine, does not have this lip, but you can adjust the guide so that the edge of the fabric can align right with the white, in this instance, guide to make stitching very easily done. Straight stitch, but adjust it a little bit. I like to lengthen the stitch traditional length is maybe 2 to 2.5. I'm going to make it longer to 3 to 3.5 because I have those thicker threads. And then I have already determined this, but I'm going to move my needle position so that I've adjusted this so that I'm sewing right on the very edge. That way I can align the guide of the foot right next to the edge of the fabric. Now I'm coming upon a pin right now, so I'll just remove that pin, and then simply sew. And when going around curves, as I have here, you can go a little slower. I always find, just like driving the mountains, you go slower when you get around the curves, and just guide that fabric along the guide of the foot. And we'll just sew a little bit more of this, get the pins out of the way, and very simple stitching. Now I'll show you this portion of the pocket that has been stitched. And this top stitching only shows on one fabric, on one layer of the fabric. If you were stitching, let's say, on a lapel or collar, where you'd see both sides of the top stitching, use double threads in the bobbin. Here I have some purple thread, unwinding again in opposite directions. And then I would just simply wind the bobbin with 2 threads. And you'll have the same width and thickness of the thread. Another top stitching tip. U is for understitching. Although it doesn't show from the right side, it plays a key role in keeping facings and undercollars in their place. I have a sample of just a portion of a facing, a neckline facing, or you could use it on armhole facings, a variety of places. And for this facing that has been stitched around this curve, I've already done trimming. Grading the seam allowance, always making the facing seam allowance the narrowest, and the garment seam allowance just a little bit wider, down to about 3/8 and 1/4 of an inch. After grading all the seam allowances, then I press prior to doing the understitching. And my preference is to press from the wrong side. Here I can allow to fold the fabric or hold the fabric so that I'm not going to get any little tucks. I want to press it flat, so just press a portion of it at a time. And you'll have the seam allowances pressed to the facing. Now most instructions will give us some guidelines to use a straight stitch to stitch the seam allowances to the facing. My preference is to use a zigzag stitch, and this is a multiple step zigzag, and I happen to know it's a little bit too wide for that narrow little seam allowance, so I'm going to place down the width, as you can see it narrowing to about 2.5, and I'm going to increase the length to about 2. Now this wider width allows the fabric to lie flatter. That's why I prefer it over a straight stitch. And then sewing from the right side, just sew in sections. You're going to have to mold the fabric when you have a curve such as this, and just sew on the facing. Now this stitch will not show from the right side. It will certainly help keep that facing to the underside because the seam allowances have been sewn in that area. And let me just get that out of the way. And I'll cut the threads. When I bring this to the right side, you'll be able to see that here's that little stitch. It's been sewn down, and the seam allowances have been stitched to that facing. And even though it hasn't been given a final press, it just folds very nicely around that edge. So whenever you're working with collars or cuffs or facings, this is how you do understitching. V is for vinyl. It's not usually thought of as a fabric, yet it's easy to incorporate it in accessory and fashion projects. When working on vinyl, whether making a handbag, a tote, perhaps a belt, you may want to incorporate some of these techniques when sewing. This fabric is really fun. It would make a fun raincoat. I'm going to make a tote out of this fabric. But yet when sewing this, you may want to consider some of these techniques. Pins, first of all, use paper clips or other types of clips to hold the fabric together. And really when sewing on the wrong side, it sews readily because the fabric has canvas attached to it, so it feeds through the machine with ease. But to press it is another story. Because of the vinyl portion of it, you would melt the fabric. So rather than pressing as normally, we're going to use a wooden pressing tool. And on the table, I just simply flatten it out with a little handheld flattening area, and it still doesn't keep it flat. So what we're going to need to do is to top stitch the area, and use a top stitching needle because the fabric is thicker, and then incorporate a roller foot. The rollers of the feet, the foot portion will aid in top stitching over this area. Now, most laminated fabrics can easily be top stitched with just the addition of a roller foot. Now I'm top stitching, obviously, a straight stitch, and I've lengthened the stitch to about 3 or 3.5. Do a little testing after you've done, before doing the stitching, and you'll see that you'll get, that will allow you to have the fabric really flat. This is the one I just stitched, and this has the stitching on both sides. Now, in times on Sewing with Nancy, we have used the clear vinyl to work with handbags or cosmetic totes, even sewing totes, adding it as pockets or adding it to the fabric. And I have the striped fabric underneath, and I'm going to borrow some of my paper clips just to hold it into place right on the fabric. And this vinyl is a little more difficult to stitch, and sometimes it doesn't want to feed through the machine. With tissue paper on each side of the presser foot, just put a strip so that the foot, instead of guiding on the fabric, is guiding on the tissue paper. And this will make the feeding of the fabric so like a breeze. So whether you're working with laminated fabric or very thick vinyl, these are some techniques that will help you in your sewing savviness. W is for wrap corners. This technique is definitely a staple in my sewing repertoire. If you watched Sewing with Nancy over the past years, perhaps you've seen this technique. It's one of my favorites because it works out so well. When having corners, generally we'll pivot. We'll sew a straight edge, pivot at the corner of this collar, for example, sew the other edge, and then pivot again at the opposite end. Well, when sewing this collar, we're going to sew 4 times without doing any pivoting. It will be assured that you'll get very sharp points. You can do trimming and understitching along the way. The first step is always to add interfacing. Interfacing both the upper collar and the under collar. And then after fusing that interfacing, meet the cut edges together along the outer edge and sew from cut edge to cut edge. On this next sample, which has been stitched, and it has also been grading the under collar the narrowest, you'll see that the stitch starts at the very cut edge and ends at the very cut edge. And now you press your seam allowances toward the under collar and do that understitching, which we just did for the letter U. So here's the understitched collar, and it's nice and flat and already trimmed in that collar point. Now, wrap the fabric. Wrap it so that those 2 edges are meeting, and the seam allowance has been wrapped to the underside. Notice right on the fold is the seam line. You can either pin it, or in this case it's just such a short seam that I can just start to sew. I'll just backtrack a little bit and sew that seam. And then after stitching this, we'll do some grading and trimming. Here we have the seam stitched, and then I'll simply cut off the corner and grade the seam allowance. Again, grading the seams so that one is a little bit longer than the other. The most common pressing tool I use is that finger press. You can just finger press that open and then turn this right side out. And as I turn this, I'll simply just encourage it with the turner, but you will see that I have a very sharp point even without pressing due to wrapped corners. Y is for yo-yos. What's old often becomes new again. In the 30s and 40s, yo-yos were used for making coverlets. Now, yo-yos are used for accents. Can be made of silk, of cotton, a variety of fabrics. Our great-grandmothers or grandmothers used lids and jars and traced on fabric. Whatever the size of the lid or circle that was traced, the yo-yo will become half the size. After trimming, as I did on this, or tracing as I did on this small sample, then trim fabric approximately 1/4 of an inch away. It doesn't have to be exact. Thread a needle. You might want to use that beeswax or thread conditioner as I used earlier in the program. Get matching color thread, not contrasting as I have here. But then you're just going to roll or turn the fabric around just kind of quarter by quarter, following the edge that was traced. And you could even use a lead pencil if it wouldn't show through on the other side. And you can take several running stitches if you'd like, which I'll do right now. Just run it around, pull the thread taut, and you'll have a yo-yo. And this will be a relatively small yo-yo when I get it completed. I think you can see as it's starting to turn the size that this will be. This will just be like a little flower yo-yo shape. Now there are more contemporary ways of making these and using a 2-section plate and disc. And there are little nods that you'll find at the end of the plate, and then markings that are on the disc. You can kind of see those. You don't even have to cut a square, just cut the fabric a little bit larger and align those 2 markings together. And you have to kind of fold back the fabric, which I'll do right now, and get everything aligned and snap into place. And then just roll the fabric on one side. Now on the underside they have little areas. There's kind of small little horseshoe areas, very small, that you sew from in and out, just making certain that you sew in this area up and down to go around the disc. And then after sewing all the way around, as you can see that I've done, then you do some trimming. Trim out the excess fabric, snap out the sections, and pull the thread. Whether you're making hundreds or just a few, which generally I just make a few for an accent, you can then tie the threads securely in the middle, and you will have a yo-yo that you can use for an accent, the perfect representation for the letter Y. Z is for zippers. Lap zippers are my favorite style. See how to use tape for ease of pinning as well as top stitching. This lap zipper showcases the simple technique, the lap, the underlay. And the first change I make is when cutting out the pattern. Within the zipper area, I allow a 1-inch seam allowance. At the very top of the fabric, I mark the 1-inch area, and I leave the zipper area open, and I've stopped sewing with the traditional 5/8 of an inch at the bottom of the zipper. After this initial stitching, then do some pressing. You're looking at the right side of the fabric, and the overlap side has been pressed under the entire 1 inch. And the underlay side, a scant 1 inch, in other words, about 7/8 of an inch, so that we have a little extra 1/8 of an inch in this area. The zipper is placed in or underneath the underlay area. And just butt the fold of the underlay area next to the coil. Notice that I have the extra length of the zipper at the top of the fabric. And then with the zipper foot on my machine, I'm just going to top stitch along this area. So I have it pinned in place, and then just simply top stitch. And you don't have to base this seam, just sew, and that's one of the 2 stitchings. I mentioned that I like to use, instead of pins for the next stop, I like to use some tape, and this really works out well. The tape is used to not only hold the fabric edges together, but also to give you a guideline. I've used 1/2 inch wide sewing tape. You may also want to use, could just use office tape. Either way works. First I put down the tape, to hold the fabrics together. And then the stitching line, and this is where I'm going to stitch right next to this tape. Starting at the bottom or the top, it really doesn't matter, whatever you would prefer. And this time I think I'm just going to start sewing at the top. I'm going to sew right along the tape, and I had the zipper foot on. I'm going to back stitch a little bit within the seam allowance, and notice that sometimes the pins perhaps might give you a little bit of a bubble or a dimple in the fabric. Because the tape is there, you certainly don't have to worry about it. And I'll stop with the needle in the fabric, and then pivot, and then sew the bottom. And with a little thread tying and removal of the tape, you have your zipper into place. And you can see as I'm pulling it away with just 2 rows of stitching, that's how you create a lapped zipper. As a kid, did you ever collect leaves, twigs, or perhaps dried weeds? My Nancy's Corner guest continues to gather interesting shapes from nature, and then she uses them for inspiration to create fabric artistry. I'd like you to welcome Barbara Schneider. Barbara is an extremely creative individual who combines photography to capture the images with photography and then creates amazing pieces out of fabric for modern art. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. And you start with an inspiration.
I do. I often just go out on a walk, either in the woods or in wetland areas, and I collect materials. It could be leaves or twigs
Sure.
or pods. And this leaf started my
What
whole journey towards these shaped leaf pieces. So this became
Oh, wow. It is amazing transformation. We have about 3 layers of fabric you mentioned.
yes. There's the front, which is pieced out of many materials. The back. Do you want to show it?
Sure.
And then a layer of batting in between. It's heavily machine stitched.
The original had circle areas, and you've emulated that with the stitching.
And then I added the satin stitching here to create the stem. And then these I made many of these, and they really didn't have any life to them
Sure.
until I had the idea of shaping them. So I've used stiffening glue, and then I shape them over whatever materials come to
Sure.
hand, and they start to take on a life
Oh.
of their own. And when I display them with multiples, you get the interaction out of the shadows
Oh.
and the undulating light, which is what I like the best.
Oh, they're really very inspirational. And this leaf was flat that you had the inspiration, but your next piece had a very dimensional leaf.
Yes. Especially in the fall, I like to collect these that have curled up on themselves in such interesting ways
Oh.
and become very sculptural. And
Extremely.
I've tried to take that idea and
And wait till you see this. This is really charming.
create the feel of that
Uh-huh.
as best I could. Again, with the fabrics, in this case, there's some addition of netting, the stitching again.
And it's free motion stitching in shapes of the vines or even just in the indentations that may be in the leaf.
And then cutting the edges so it's that same
Oh,
feel
yes.
of the little sharp edges on it. And then again, this was combined with several other leaves to make a whole piece. And I like the way
Oh,
they feel
I do too.
and the way they capture the light and shadow.
Very striking. Now, the next illustration inspiration came from very small leaves
Yes.
and that were, unfortunately, were eaten away by Japanese beetles.
Yes. So these little linden leaves, they seem to love
Yes.
linden trees, just are so minutely
Like lace.
like lace, yes. And so in this case, I did
And here's let's show the finished result.
okay.
It's about 5 to 6 feet in width.
yes.
It's stunning, and it captures even the same cutaway areas, and it has great. You just find myself that I kept looking at this piece because it draws you to it. But you used a little different technique for this particular.
Yes, for this technique, or for this piece, the technique I used was to scan those leaves and print them out. I blew
In a
them up
very
quite large
right.
and printed them out on my home printer.
And here you probably can't see. I had a hard time seeing this, but here they're pieced right in there, so it's not just one piece of fabric. It's
Right.
tiled.
It's tiled together and then backed. And then I would go back in and again do the stitching. And after the stitching, I used my little tiny nail scissors and cut out all of these spaces.
Oh.
And then did the same thing in terms of the shaping that I've done on the
Oh.
other pieces. And this piece is fairly recent.
Oh, it's very striking.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this. What a unique way of working with fabric and stiffeners and layering and machine embroidery. Thank you, Barbara.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. For more information on Barbara's fiber art, you can go to nancyzeman.com and then click on Nancy's Corner. At nancyzeman.com, you'll also be able to see additional episodes of Sewing with Nancy, read my blog, and find out additional information. And you'll find that we are now coming to a close of Sewing A to Z. We've done 3 programs of Sewing A to Z, and hope you'll learn from these basic techniques. Bye for now.
Nancy has written a full-color, fully illustrated book entitled Nancy Zeman Sewing A to Z that includes all the information featured in this series. It's $19.99 plus shipping and handling. To order the book, call 800-336-8373 or visit our website at sewingwithNancy.com/2501. Order item number Y0005. Nancy Zeman Sewing A to Z. Credit card orders only. To pay by check or money order, call the number on the screen for details. Visit Nancy's website at nancyzeman.com to see additional episodes, Nancy's blog, and more. Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest-airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zeman, has been brought to you by Baby Lock, Madeira Threads, Koala Studios, Clover, Amazing Designs, and Class A Needles. Closed captioning funding provided by Rowenta. Sewing with Nancy is a co-production of Nancy Zeman Productions and Wisconsin Public Television.